Hi, comrades. I know it's the end of a very long day, but of course, this is one of the critical topics before us. We're meeting in the midst of a deepening of several intersecting global capitalist crises. And of course, that includes the inability of the ruling classes to resolve the fundamental economic contradictions of the moment, the resulting growth of inter-imperialist rivalry and threat of war. And it's in that context that the acute failure of the major imperialist powers to present any kind of viable plan to stave off climate catastrophe is occurring. And it's compounded by the related failure to meet the challenge of the COVID pandemic. And both of these, the latter, have contributed to an already critical economic crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic, though, showed to many millions the true nature of the capitalist system. It exposed the major driving force of the system, profit-making, and the total disregard for human life and the environment. But the tepid responses of Washington did also include easy talk about the episodic application of the Defense Production Act to command the required production. And it also included it also sparked responses of union workers to that paradigm, like those of General Electric in Lynn, Massachusetts, who demanded to make ventilators, not military hardware, as the pandemic hit its peak. That is, the pandemic in many ways created a new context in which to discuss and organize to meet the existential challenge of staving off climate catastrophe. Working people can intuit much more easily both the options available and see more clearly, accept more easily, I think, the unwillingness of capitalist governments to employ those options. And of course, these crises continue to increase misery and despair in a context in which the best economic recovery that even the richest imperialist nations can promise will not return us to pre-pandemic levels of annual growth. Most bourgeois economists are openly predicting a severe recession next year. It is truly an explosive situation. As Justin persuasively argued in the last session yesterday, we're attempting to advance the construction of a revolutionary party in a new context. In this new situation, the capitalist crisis produced by the I don't even know how to say it, the capitalist scene, is, I would argue, the driving force of destruction we're facing. It aggravates all social and economic inequalities in the world, presents an objective threat to humanity and the profit-making system itself. The ruling classes are most certainly headed toward the destruction of the current climate system and the ecosystem, and with it, the decimation of a significant part of humanity. Only a revolution can stop it and reverse the trend with a new socialist model, free of oppression and exploitation, and based on workers' democracy. That is a system in which the working class and the oppressed democratically can sit in the driver's seat and make the decisions on production and social reproduction. That is the kind of setup, this being the only kind of system that could help restore the climactic and ecological balance. What kind of data can we use to explain this reality to our class? There's a growing certainty among a layer of climate scientists that the capitalist system, based on the continuous growth of production for profit, is incompatible with the ability to sustain human life on the planet. They're providing us with a lot of data and easy write-ups. Ecosocialist Christian Zeller, who wrote Inspector on December 30th, 2021, explained the sixth assessment report of the working group from the IPCC, acknowledged the inescapable consequences of the failure to reduce emissions. And of course, we understand that means to reduce production dramatically in the next several decades. Based on their scenarios, he tells us what to expect. In order to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius with a probability of 50%, the world may still emit 500 gigatons of CO2. We're not even talking methane here. To achieve a probability of 83% that we could not overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius, the total emission budget would be 300 gigatons of CO2. What does this mean concretely? Zeller gives us a little way to think about it. If the world continues to emit 40 gigatons of CO2 per year to stay within this limit, in order to stay within this limit, every machine worldwide that emits CO2 would have to be shut down immediately by 2030. This calculation doesn't even take into account the ecological debt that the early industrialized imperialist countries who've been colonizing the atmosphere with their emissions already owe to the global south. But of course, CO2 emissions are not being reduced at all. They continue to rise significantly, the latest burst being associated with the war in Ukraine. If this rate of emissions is not halted, the average surface temperature could heat up by 3.3 to 5.7 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. That is a temperature that human beings cannot adapt to in any way or in any form. That would be tantamount to a complete collapse of the climate system. But that's not all that our class needs to know. We also have to be completely honest about what it will take to remedy the situation. Any emergency transition to clean renewable fuel, any construction for adaptation requires a burst of energy use, a lot of energy. So we have a carbon budget of at most 500 gigatons, and this massive new investment of energy for transition and for adaptation to save humans facing the current results of global warming has to take place within a greenhouse gas emission framework of that budget of 300 gigatons of carbon. It completely, totally, the end. All right. Now, how does the think tanks, the bourgeois think tanks, deal with this? They say the historic way of dealing with this is they advocate the removal of 1,000 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere by 2050 by tree planting, burning biomass, and negative emissions technology, carbon capture and sequestration. All of these assumptions are based on technology that either does not currently exist, or we have no reason to believe is scalable, or there are dangerous choices that threaten food production and other necessities, or have unknown consequences that could be equally disastrous. And planting a lot of new trees doesn't do it either. It doesn't even come close, as new trees do not have the same sequestration capacity. There's no capitalist road to safe global temperatures because there's no way forward that does not depend on a deep cut in production for profit to free parts of our remaining carbon budget for a massive transition to truly renewable energy, to non-polluting transportation, to agroecological food production, and all the adaptive measures we need to protect those most in harm's way. This leads to the inescapable conclusion that the only social force capable of driving forward the needed measures and the concomitant rise in energy, the only force that doesn't benefit from the constant expansion of production and the concomitant rise in energy consumption is, of course, the working class. And the working class that does not have an interest in this system that is only immiserated by the continuation, expansion of production and productivity. And the working class has never been able to seize the power to transform production without a revolution. Thus far, our class has not held the power long enough in any situation to spread the revolution globally and initiate production for human needs, not profit, on the scale necessary. But we've had enough experience historically within our class to know that this is possible. Is revolution in time to matter possible? Yes, it is. because revolutions are not the product of a slow evolution of political consciousness, but come often with a dramatic break from politics as usual, a sudden rupture whose preparation we can only see in hindsight. And a revolution in even one corner of the globe can almost instantly transform politics everywhere. Think of the impact of the Russian Revolution, or even the Cuban Revolution, on world politics and the class struggle. As we have been discussing all weekend, we're now functioning in a volatile world shaped by crisis upon crisis, mass displacement due to climate in the midst of the threat of inter-imperialist war. Yes, revolution is on the agenda. Now, we've already seen that workers and farmers and fisher people and indigenous communities are going into the struggle over the early impacts of the intertwined climate and economic crises. The Syrian revolution was sparked by drought and inadequate government response. Massive upsurges in Latin America are inextricably tied to the fight against big extractivism, corporate agriculture, and the imperialist imposition of both. The 2019 Chilean upsurge has led to a massive national discussion about a program of nationalization of extraction under workers' control, so they can deal with imperialism, finance, the water, and other ecological crises expected from warming. From peasant and indigenous struggles everywhere, we've seen the capacity to fight for the removal of the land from a system of commodification and speculation. Everywhere we see struggles around housing, transportation, and healthcare that are relevant. If we follow the reports of trade unions for energy democracy, we see that the struggle over privatization of utilities is a fire all over the world. Each episode of devastation of working class lives by extreme weather holds the potential for an advancing and developing a national struggle with national demands for funds for resettlement and compensation. Each struggle for immigrant rights shines a light on the displacement and disruption of working class lives and cries out for an explanation of the way forward for humanity. We have to review our responsibility for this issue in this light. Of course, it's not sufficient to explain that revolution is necessary. Our job is to intervene in a systematic way with a transitional approach that links the current stage of the struggle and the current level of consciousness to an understanding of and motion around demands that put the question of class political power on the agenda. What kind of program for this struggle can we develop in conjunction with the fightbacks already occurring around the globe? How can we codify and prepare a compilation of measures, immediate demands around issues that have put people in motion, and transitional ones that help expose the role of the capitalist state? Without such a program, we're needlessly weakened in the political fight in all of our organizing spaces and in the unions. We're less able to combat the false solutions put forward daily by the capitalist think tanks and taken up by reformist organizations within our organizations and unions. This is not the only origin of false solutions. Not only the Green New Deal and fake technological solutions, but a kind of declassed ideological program of degrowth that approaches the solution without an understanding of the class divide and the agency of the working class. So we know that such a program for action we need to develop that, those of us in this room, based on our involvement in the struggles. What kind of climate program would a workers' party, the one we keep talking about, actually put forward, fight for on a national scale and in the unions? These are questions we have to answer. So I'm going to put forward a series quickly of demands just to get us thinking and talking about what that kind of program, transitional kind of a action program for climate could be as a way to start the discussion, because of course, this is something we have to do together out of our deep involvement, engagement with the mass movement. So it's certainly, it would, pardon?
2 minutes.
Okay, certainly it would include stop burning fossil fuels, nationalizing the fossil fuel industry in order to convert it immediately to a means of generating wind, solar, geothermal, and other kinds of renewable Energy, that conversion process has to be placed under the democratic control of the working class. End all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Stop the build out, close the refineries and the pipelines by providing jobs and union wages for former oil workers and all whose jobs are affected. Could I have, do you think, 3 minutes to, okay. 2, a just transition must not only include jobs for those formerly employed by the fossil fuel companies, but a massive job creating investment for new public health positions and infrastructure, climate change mitigating construction and remediation, new infrastructure and jobs in public transportation, reforestation and conservation, and for the more labor intensive practice of agroecology, and jobs associated with the sustainable development of regions and countries heretofore deprived of such investment. Climate must be seen as a public health crisis. Floods and fires not only kill people directly, they also spread airborne particulates, which can harm health. Climate change has led to the spread of zoonotic and tropical diseases. High temperatures are a health issue for people in treeless urban heat islands, as well as for farm workers, construction workers, and urban workers. A significant preventive measures have to be taken, as well as measures to immediately ameliorate unhealthy conditions. These needs and remedies can be determined by joint health worker and community assemblies. Healthcare should be socialized and free for all. 3, the country must be rebuilt to deal with climate change. Housing, schools, and workplaces must all be constructed and reconditioned for sustainability and safety in the face of the new threats of deadly heat, urban firestorms, and pandemics. Demands would include housing for all, massive government investment to construct low-cost housing for working people, to restore and improve current housing in places that are healthy to live and in which people can thrive. At the same time, conservation of materials and land is essential. Suburban sprawl should be reversed and the land restored to maximize carbon sequestration or ecologically sound farming. All construction and restoration work should be carried out by union labor with affirmative action hiring and training for women and oppressed people of country. Work can be rotated in order to reduce hours, 30 hours work for 40 hours pay and full benefits, which would spread the work to more jobs to more workers. The US is the country's largest military polluter. No funds for the military. Convert military production to production for human needs. Close all military bases. Use the resources for climate mitigation brigades to bring aid to those victimized by the imperialist nations. And imperialist predation in defense of corporate extractivism. Cancel the debt, including the new debt that came with the COVID loans. Take responsibility for loss and damage to the less developed world. Provide the $6 trillion that is said to be needed, and the bulk of the remaining carbon budget of 500 gigatons to the less developed world to alleviate misery and poverty while developing sustainable energy and agriculture. Open the borders. Full support for the sensible adaptation of migration from zones now unfarmable or uninhabitable for extreme weather. Currently, the US is spending 11 times more on border militarization than on its contribution to the Global Climate Finance Fund. We must win our Anglo co-workers to positions of solidarity with workers, peasants, and indigenous peoples. We must understand the gift of their immigration, their class struggle experience, and what it can mean to develop the class struggle in the US. All people have the right to clean water, and we can talk about all the elements of that. Land cannot be a commodity or the object of speculative activity. Nationalize the land. Use this measure to give land back with veto rights to indigenous nations, and subsidies for corporate agriculture, funding for agricultural, agroecological, and urban farming. Farm workers should receive free healthcare and union wages, food sovereignty from the fields to the retail and service industries to the consumer. Funding for mass transportation for all working people to take jobs, to jobs or services to replace the obligatory use of the auto. Women are the nation's leading healthcare, home care, childcare, and elder care workers, but must often work double and triple days. Everywhere, the conditions wrought by climate change will make this work more onerous. free and safe public childcare and pre-kindergarten education, stop sexual violence, support women fleeing sexual violence and harassment, no to population as schemes falsely presented as climate solutions. And finally, of course, shorten the work week with no reduction in pay. We need national assemblies of working people to prioritize the production necessary for human needs and propose which production of unnecessary goods for profit must be shut down to dramatically reduce emissions on an emergency basis. And we must point out that all of these items on production, land use, transportation, healthcare should be carried out in conjunction with a global plan to fulfill the needs of human beings and all life on Earth. And all this, of course, requires a democratically run social system that no longer functions according to the dictates of the capitalist class. We should say, we believe that working people in the United States should form a party with this objective in their sights, an action-oriented workers' party with a clear program for a socialist revolution. So I just want to say that it's strange that we have not yet come together to begin to draft and codify and work with our colleagues and comrades in the mass movement to develop such a program that can reflect the working class solution to the climate crisis. And I just hope that part of what we do here today is decide that task and then taking that program, intervening collectively around the country on both national, local basis, in taking it to organizing spaces into our union is something that we can begin to think out how to do. Personally, I think that this is a path not only to saving the planet and our species, but it's also, in a shorter term perspective, the path to a meaningful regroupment, one that is based on the struggle in the United States. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Hi. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around for this conference. It's been wonderful. Thanks again, Chris, for that fantastic, brilliant, just detailed overview of this really crucial topic. I want to talk a little bit about first, international indigenous resistance and how we build this eco-socialism. And I want to talk about how that connects with abolition ecology and the failure of eco-capitalism, as Chris mentioned, and green capitalism. And yeah, and then we can talk about, you know, what is to be done, and we can further discuss that. So you know, wherever we walk, wherever we are on indigenous land. And a recent fight that I want to highlight is the campaign and movement to stop Line 3, a crude oil pipeline in so-called Canada to Wisconsin. I think this resistance really highlights the importance of indigenous-led resistance. 5 Ojibwe tribes have resisted this pipeline replacement project. The White Earth, Red Lake, Fond du Lac, Leech, all of these bands have resisted this project and been very active in leading, and also, you know, very much inspiring other people to take action. You know, this pipeline, you know, after Standing Rock and No Dapple, this is one of a major pipelines in so-called North America, and it's a huge threat to land and water. So this is the most recent fight. Of course, if we just kind of go back a little to, you know, to Standing Rock, it inspired millions to protect our Earth, and inspired so many people to come out all over the world, all over Turtle Island, and reminded us the role, you know, of the police state is to, you know, harass and suppress these revolutionary and important protests and uprisings. And then, you know, coupled with this, you know, since forever, indigenous folks have been organizing all over the world against destructive resource extraction of natural resources. And just to review the extraction of resources, biomass, fossil fuels, metals, non-metallic minerals make up about half of the global greenhouse gas emissions, while contributing to more of 90% of diversity loss and water stress impacts. So this is specific, irreversible damage that, Chris mentioned in the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change report, and also Oxfam and others have said, these are sort of irreversible things that are happening. And specifically, resource extraction has really in the focus of indigenous resistance in El Salvador and Bolivia and Ecuador and a lot of areas in the Amazon. Women have been leading this resistance. The mandate of Amazonian women defenders of the jungle of the bases against extractivism includes, 22 points that women say should be addressed immediately. This was very many years ago. Most of which involve putting a stop to all oil and mining activities in the Amazon. So, we can really look at, in terms of indigenous-led fights and food and land sovereignty movements in Brazil and Chile and elsewhere, of challenging this green capitalism and replacing it with this international ecosocialism. Coming back to so-called United States, here the land back movement, it started with settler colonialism and genocide and violent theft of indigenous land. And it continues today to be, an increasingly popular way for folks to get involved and to be, in solidarity with indigenous-led and indigenous-centered struggles against climate catastrophe. So according to the Indian Collective, the Land Back website clarifies that the land back movement has existed for many centuries and continues to exist based on the following statement. It is a relationship with Mother Earth that is symbiotic and just, where we have reclaimed stewardship. It is bringing our people with us as we move towards liberation and embody sovereignty through an ongoing political organizing and narrative framework. It is a long legacy of warriors and leaders who sacrificed freedom and life. It is a catalyst for current generation organizers and centers the voices of those who represent our future. And so these are just sort of examples of how, a part of the reason why we're in this climate catastrophe is ignoring the knowledge and the technology of indigenous people, right? So I just really want to emphasize that point because I think it's important. So yeah, it is recognizing that our struggle is interconnected with the struggles of all oppressed peoples. And so that's what the Land Back website says. So, in connecting these struggles, I think there's an idea, a concept that is called abolition ecology. And essentially what it means is it comes from in 1946, W.E. Du Bois gave a speech to youth in Columbia, South Carolina, illustrating the need for land back and liberation for the proletariat. And Du Bois wrote in 1946, there is a chance for a new cooperative agriculture on renewed land owned by the state with capital furnished by the state, mechanized and coordinated with city life. There is a chance for strong trade unions without race discrimination, with high wage, closed shop, decent conditions of work to beat back and hold in check the swarm of landlords, monopolists, and profiteers who are today sucking the blood out of the land. It would be a shame and cowardice to surrender this glorious land and its opportunities for civilization and humanity to the thugs and lynchers, the mobs and profiteers, the monopolists and gamblers who today choke its soul and steal its resources. The oil and the sulfur, the coal and iron, the cotton and corn, lumber and cattle belong to you, the workers, black and white, not to the thieves who hold them and use them to enslave you. And so I really appreciate that that quote from a really inspiring speech that W.E.B. Du Bois gave, because it kind of introduces us to this, Black-led resistance and Black ecosocialism. So yeah, and then we talked a little bit yesterday about revolutionary abolitionism. And so I think this I wanted to tie this into this idea of like how we get free from and how the land is ours. Actually, I'm going to skip that. Oh, okay. So in this idea of abolition ecology is surmised by a writer. So building upon Du Bois, abolition ecology is an effort to take abolitionist ideas created through hard-fought struggles to better organize around the racialized questions of who gains from and who pays from, who benefits from and who suffers from particular processes of political ecological change. Obviously we can see the connection between, environmental racism and the issue of Black, Indigenous, and people of color being most affected by the horrors of our environment and climate catastrophe. Then I wanted to just sort of talk about
5 minutes.
What Chris sort of outlined this in a fabulous way of the failures of eco-capitalism and green capitalism. So I feel like we have a good grasp on that. I wanted to sort of highlight ideas on like what we can think about instead of the Green New Deal or things that have failed, like what is to be done. And so I think that there are certain ideas and platforms that have been put out by various groups, and I think it would be worth it to talk about sort of some of these ideas. And so the most notable one that is sort of an alternative to the Green New Deal is the concept of the Red Deal, which was created by a group of folks, indigenous folks in Farmington, New Mexico, and comrades of the Red Nation, which consider themselves revolutionary socialists and are revolutionary socialists. So the Red Deal is really, it's a movement-oriented document for climate justice and grassroots reform and revolution. It's a political platform not aimed to please politicians. It's contrary actually to the politicians and status quo. It's something organized in 4 parts. The first part is that the first part states that what creates crisis cannot solve it. In other words, the bourgeoisie and capitalist class, capitalism cannot solve this climate crisis. The second part is politicians can't do what only mass movements do. The third part is change from below and to the left. And the fourth part is from theory to action. And so this is just one sort of example of something that, when we talk about, creating a program and working within our local groups, that's another thing. Also, I think that there are unions who are involved in unions for energy democracy. And so I think that's another way that we can sort of get involved. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.